And it's exciting, but it's rocks in the road in a sense. It's definitely not what people, when they're first making the atomic bomb, for instance, they didn't know about leptons. They didn't know about tauons. They didn't know about any of that stuff. They certainly didn't know about dark matter, or they probably made a bigger bomb. And I mean, nobody really knows about dark matter. Dark matter is a myth, okay? And now there's a lot more of them that are closer to home and that are likely to cost you a lot of money. And we ought to keep all that stuff in mind. Global warming. This is one of those cool things where there is not a shred of evidence. And I'm not lying to you. I've been studying this for a long time. I've read a lot of books about it, and I've read a lot of the research papers. There isn't a shred of evidence that human beings have had any effect on this planet other than just billboards. I mean, we put out a lot of billboards and buildings and stuff. We haven't affected the climate. And the CO2 has such a tiny effect. Even the CO2 that's there, the bulk of which isn't our problem, it's always there. You know, and the guys that are now running that, like the people that got in trouble at Hadley Center, which is like University of East Anglia in England, that got their emails all published, and some of them were kind of embarrassing. Those guys, they're like computer jocks. They're not climatologists. And in my opinion, climate is something that didn't start in 1900. You know, if you want to know about climate and climate change, then you need to know things like when was the Eocene and what was the weather like. The Eocene was like about 40 million years ago, and the planet was pretty much trees. There were gymnosperms because the angiosperms hadn't happened yet, but there were trees from pole to pole. And it was a fairly temperate time, and the CO2 levels, and we know this all from proxy measurements and stuff, but they're pretty decent measurements, were 2,700 parts per million. That they're now 340, which is a little higher than 270, which is what they were historically before we started supposedly polluting the atmosphere. But there's a big difference between 340 and 2,700. And until people can say, how the hell did we come, and it was a temperate, it was fairly decent weather all the way around the world. Nobody understands that. Nobody understands how that moved from the Eocene to the Miocene, to the Pliocene, to the Pleistocene. All those names that you've maybe heard about refer to long periods in geological history where we have evidence that there was this, and then there was that, and then there was this. We don't have any evidence. We don't have any real ideas. How did it change? Why did the Eocene go away? Why was it replaced by the Miocene? You know, and in my opinion, until you can start looking back at those things with all the data we have on them and say, here's what happened, because it certainly wasn't people. I mean, during the Miocene, there weren't any apes even. There weren't any mammals, really, to speak of. I mean, there were mammals, but there weren't any primates. And there wasn't a lot of CO2 being made by cars. And like, it didn't happen because of CO2. It probably had something to do with the fact that the Earth, in its orbit, is not exactly always pointed in the same direction. It's processing around its poles. It's nutating around that, meaning it's accelerating and decelerating of that precession. It's pointing in all different directions over long periods of time that can actually be, you can predict them. I mean, they're not like random things. It's just like, yeah, it's a big top, and it's affected by all these other planets and stuff. And you should be able to take those things and make some sense out of them in terms of climatology. And somebody named Milankovitch did that years and years ago. He said, yeah, it should change. It is not, the natural state of the Earth is not that it's 69 degrees all the time in San Diego. That's just lately. It's not the state, the nature of the beast is that it undergoes fairly, we're not sure why, but fairly catastrophic changes from time to time. Sometimes they're quite uncomfortable for people, and species go extinct and others become, like we did, during what we call the Holocene, or the last couple of million years, we became quite successful as a species because the climate was changing rapidly, and we were able to adapt to it. That's the natural state of things here, you know. And it isn't because of us that it happened; it's because it happened that we're here. And it's really silly for people to walk around saying, "Save the Earth," you know, from us. Like we're like the moss that grows on the rocks here. We're not a very big part of it. We really aren't. We've overblown our presence here. And that is a foolish paradigm that we have allowed to sort of permeate in a whole field. And all the real climatologists have been replaced by these guys that write global circulation models that say, if this happens, then the temperature will go up by 5 degrees within the next. They usually give themselves a good little margin of error there. By the time I'm dead, the temperature will have gone up 4 degrees or something. And that will cause a big problem in terms of rice production and all that stuff. And these guys are just sitting there with their little computers. And they're doing all that stuff, and they don't really know very much about climatology, in my opinion. And climatology has become a kind of a joke. The people that are real climatologists do think about things like all the global epochs that the Earth has gone through in our way of looking at it. But the guys that are getting the headlines and stuff, and that are meeting in Copenhagen and deciding that everybody's got to stop cooking over sterno stoves in Africa or whatever. I mean, those people don't know nothing. They really don't. And if you read it, it's boring. It's clearly not made for you to understand. They have so many acronyms in the papers, like in Science and Nature. You know, every time they use a phrase, they immediately reduce it to 4 letters or whatever, and it makes it hard for a non-specialist to understand what they're talking about. You have to go back and forth and back and forth. What the hell does this stand for? What does this mean? Why don't they just write it? Ink is not that expensive. And it's just, it makes it hard for someone who's a non-specialist to really understand what those things are. And this is in magazines like Science and Nature that are really written, supposedly, for the non-specialist, scientifically trained person. And in my opinion, all that stuff should get out of there. It makes them talk to themselves, basically, rather than to other people. And then they start having these big, you know, then they talk to people like Al Gore and they say, hey Al, here's a great way for you to make money now that you're not the vice president. And they're all doing it in, you know, like it's for the Earth. Save the Earth from people, you know. And by the way, every species that is supposed to be here is. We don't need any new ones, and we don't want to lose any old ones. Let's stop evolution. Let's just quit it, because it was a bad idea, you know? It was a really bad idea that things should go extinct. You know, anything that's fuzzy, particularly, you don't want it to go extinct. That's a paradigm. It's almost a paradigm that things should not go extinct. And that if they do, it's our fault. You know, it's something we did. And it's really not that hard for people with a good little imagination and some terrible guilt. I don't know where that came from, except maybe it's because of the decline of a lot of people's religious faith has kind of dropped off a little bit, and they have a sort of feeling that they're bad or something. I'm not sure what it is. I know I'm not causing climate change. I mean, when I'm riding my bicycle, I'm blowing out a little CO2, and there's probably somebody with a satellite watching me. You know, the IPCC is always checking you out, and they're going to say, you're polluting. And I'm just breathing. That's what science is about, though. I mean, really down at the bottom of it, any little field of science is there's some point where you really don't know for sure anything. You don't know. You make it up, and you keep working to prove that it's not true. But that's all you can do is finally prove that it's not true. You can't ever really prove something is true, because you might be missing the other 95% of the universe that sort of said, no, that wasn't actually true. That was just a little fluke. I'll talk about some more things here. I'm going to talk eventually, I think, about what I'm doing for real. Because I'm working on something that's much more down to earth than all that stuff. But all that stuff, the reason I love it is it is down to earth. It really is the guts of what we call modern science, and what science has been really since about the 17th century. There's around in there that we stopped using scholastic sources to figure out things. We started using empirical methods. We said, if I want to teach you something about science, I don't hand you a book that's all musty and say, read this and then you'll know. I say, look at this thing, this is an experiment I can do. And you can do it too. I have to give you the ways to do it. There's no smoke, no mirrors. It's all real. And it is because of that change that happened 350 years ago maybe, that everyone in this room basically has got something. And even with them, you've turned them all off. But you've got things that kings in the 17th century would have probably gone to war for. I've studied that longer than you've been alive.
Yeah.
Okay? And I know all about it. I know where you're getting your information.
In all due respect, you're a chemist, not a climatologist.
Wait a minute.
You're just a chemist.
No, I'm not just a chemist. I am not just a chemist. In fact, right now I'm an infectious disease guy, but you are just a little boy, and you haven't done your homework.
Well, how many climate papers have you published?
What's that?
How many climate papers have you published?
I haven't published any climate papers, but I'm in touch with a lot of people who have written books about it. And you know what?
He's right. You're not a climate scientist.
That doesn't mean anything.
It means what?
A scientist doesn't have to be a specialist.
Really? Are you not qualified to talk about that?
Quiet.
Respectfully, you are.
I'm qualified to talk about climatology.
Have you published it?
What? You don't have to publish. I don't want to get in a fight with you, sir, but I will.
You're telling my
And your son is too small.
One more question.
Yeah. Do you think that science does a better job at disproving its fables, if you will, than the rest of humankind's institutions, whether it's education or religion or politics or the notion of nation states or whatever?
Absolutely. It's set out, and in fact I have the answer to that written down somewhere. Of all the institutions on the planet, science is the one where that's set in, and that's part of the deal. If you can come up with something that disproves something that is thought of as being true, that's welcomed by other science. I mean, the guy whose idea it was isn't always so happy about it, but that's the way the system works, and that you get rewarded for that, and that's how it advances. It's when you show that a paradigm is no longer true, it opens up a whole new ball game, which is how science works. It's why I like it. You're not supposed to be hard-headed in science. You're supposed to be ready for the things that you really believe in to turn out to not be true, and you're supposed to enjoy that. You know?
Thank you. Let's have a thanks for our speaker. By the way, my students, when I was talking about scientific method, that's what we were talking about.